Good morning, everybody. It's Connection Point Conversation again on Wednesday. Sometimes I like to call it Wisdom Wednesday because Thomas is definitely wise. So he's going to join us in a little bit. So I'm looking forward to seeing him again because we have such great chats. And it's really nice to see all of you as well. Today, I have to say that this is one of my favorite subjects. The reason it's one of my favorite subjects is I think it's because it's something I've been grappling with since I was a really little girl. So we're going to discuss communication. We're going to start the conversation today, and then it's going to continue next Wednesday. We're going to do it in two pieces, which I really hope that you will enjoy. What we're going to talk about today is the qualities that we need to learn about, if it's something we haven't actually already have, to be able to have those really difficult conversations. So we kind of presented it as how to deal with difficult people. So that's kind of what we're going to do, is how to figure that one out, how to have those difficult conversations. So there's a real downside to not having the difficult conversation. Now, Thomas put it on one of his posts, and it was I'm just going to add Thomas in here. Say good morning, and hopefully he will be arriving fairly soon. Good morning, Kevin. Thomas, Kevin, Dolan. I keep writing all your whole name out all the time, and it's like, that's a lot of names.
That's a lot of names. Mom called me Kevin all the time, so when I hear a woman say Kevin, it's like, oh, my heart is full. Good morning,
You know
Mia.
what's really interesting, though, is to me, I shouldn't say this, but people sometimes look like certain names, right? To me, you look like Kevin.
Oh, thank you. That's probably why Mom always said Kev. I love you,
Oh,
Kev. So thank you for
oh,
that. I appreciate that.
oh. Well, I'm sorry. But anyway, so what we were discussing is actually what I got to the point in the introduction of what you wrote, which was fantastic on one of our posts that you did. And I loved it because it was about the downsides of not showing up for the difficult conversation. So I loved what you wrote. I'm going to read it out. It says, avoidance causes increased internal stress. Of course it does. It causes anxiety, it causes stress, it causes you hunch your shoulders and all that, because you're holding on to something that's actually important that you need to express. Frustration often leads to emotional outbursts. Well, of course, we all know that if you tried to hold the ball under the water, one day it's just going to go boom. And that's what happens. And we all know that because we've either experienced it ourselves, and then it's like, okay, let's back up the train. Look at all the things that led to that, or we've experienced with other people doing it towards us. Now, the other one is procrastination usually results in bigger issues, which it really does, because it compounds. And as it compounds, it builds up huge amounts of resentment. And we know that as soon as you start to feel resentful in the relationship, you start to close off from that feeling of love and openness and connection. Mm-hmm. So resentment is one of the really downsides, I think, of not communicating. Now, before we launch into everything, I just do want to say this is communication is something we hear about all the time. Oh, you have to communicate, it takes work, la, 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 la. I don't really believe that it takes work. I don't think that's the right word for it. It is something, it's a skill that we haven't actually learned. I know in my generation, I think more so in the younger generation, they seem to be better communicators. For us, I know, we didn't learn that when we were kids. It's something that I've really been watching and I'm passionate about since I was a little girl, simply because I had a lot of difficult people in my life. We're going to also define what a difficult person is, I hope. One thing I just want to caveat I want to say is, I'm assuming, because we've talked a little bit this week, Thomas and I, that we're not talking about people who are pathological or abusers or narcissists or gaslighters. Those people you can't actually communicate with. They wouldn't be safe to communicate with. I think you and I are wanting to discuss how you have those difficult conversations in terms of presenting what's important to you, what your needs are and your values, either at work or in personal relationships, whether it's partners, whether it's children, and all of that, parents, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's what we're discussing, at least I hope so. So I'm really glad to have you here, Thomas. I really don't like to do this by myself. Now, next week, Thomas is abandoning us to go home to Hawaii. And geez, I feel so bad for him. And I'm going to be on my own, but I'm going to do the second half about communication, which is sort of a structure that I've created. So I think that that's going to be fairly easy for me to do on my own. But today we're here to, let's talk about what a difficult conversation is, because I know for me, it's taken me a lifetime to learn that growing up with an addict, which has an awful lot of narcissistic qualities to it, being married to a narcissist, and experiencing a lot of people who, I don't know if you've heard the term gaslighters, but are extreme gaslighters. They deny what you're saying. They tell you you're wrong. They argue with you. They escalate it until you've got this brinkmanship going on in the relationship. I've had to learn, it's that art of discernment again, who you can communicate with in a intimate, you're knowing that what you feel and what you think and what you need is just as important to them as theirs are to you. Whether it's a collaborative relationship at work, where you need each other because you're doing something together, you're a team, and the same thing being a team in a family or a couple or whatever that looks like. So it's taken me a lifetime. So I'm really passionate about what it takes to learn to be a good communicator, because I didn't have that. Now, I know we talked a little bit about the other day, but I'm hoping that you'll just share a little bit about what you think about communication.
Oh my gosh. Yes, we did talk about that.
How do I
feel? Well, when we chose to dive into this, I think oftentimes, Mia, I choose with you things that really resonate with me and bumps I've had in my life along the road. And of course, the story I shared with you, which I'll share in a moment, but specifically hard issues really take a certain know-how, don't they? Mm-hmm. And understanding to address, but there's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally when we're dealing with the trauma of past experience or this inner critic that exists for me, telling me that I'm not even worthy to actually suggest that I've got a voice. So that idea of creating my own level of safety within the context of a relationship, and then realizing that, like you, and perhaps it's a generational thing because we share that, wouldn't it have been lovely that in elementary school, junior high school, even high school, there was a course that it was a relationship course, it was a communication course, but of course we didn't get that. So for me, as I ruminated with some of the things that I was challenged by that would not have me be anybody that would want to embark upon or even consider having a difficult conversation with anybody, avoid, deny. And I thought of two circumstances. One was with my older brother, John. Bless him. John has taken his last breath some time ago, but he wanted to gift me with kind of my first car, and I wanted to pay him for that first car, and I was working part-time in Calgary, and eventually got to the point where I realized I couldn't do that. Mia, I could not have a conversation with my brother John. I couldn't tell him that I couldn't pay for it. I couldn't tell him that I didn't want the car. So instead what I did was I talked to my mom, who was a really great triangulator as far as communication was concerned. So there was an opportunity for me to realize that, because in the end, as it turned out, my brother would say to my mom, that's completely okay. But of course I had this big giant story that my brother wouldn't love me, he wouldn't like me, and being the older brother, he might even beat up the little brother. So I lost an opportunity. As I reflected back, I lost an opportunity. And of course I did the best I could, right? Brene Brown tells us that we've always doing the best that we could. But I lost a really simple opportunity that I thought was actually really, really scary for me. And then the second circumstance was coming out to my father. He was really intertwined with my relationship that I had with my wife at the time. And he really loved this woman that I loved. And when I came out, I didn't speak with him initially about it. So he didn't know what the story was. And I was counseled by his sister, my aunt, an amazing woman who just said, Thomas, and she was coming from the vantage point of Catholicism. This is going to kill him, right? My father was an altar boy, was all things Catholic. So suggested I not talk
Oh.
to him. Don't have that difficult
Mm.
conversation with him. It will kill him. And then secondarily, John, my older brother at the time again, said, because Dad was the alcoholic, he said, he's actually going to beat you up when you tell him this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So what you helped me remember was, to a degree, so this time I'm 29 years old. It's a completely different time in my life. Married kind of 25, so 4 years in a marriage.
Oh, Thomas has gone a little bit. Okay, hang on
Catholicism
a
and
minute.
straightness.
You might want to just repeat that because I don't know whether it was what was happening, but you kind of cut out a little bit. So just maybe repeat so
Got
we
it.
know where, yeah, there was a little
There was a
glitch.
call that was coming in. There's a little bit. So I was counseled by two people not to tell my father. One said if I told him
Yeah.
it would kill him, and the other one said he'll beat you up. So it was the first time I could remember actually creating a bit of a process for myself,
Mm.
which is kind of astounding for who it was I was being at 29 years old and the issue I was dealing with. So now I'm separate. I've come out to my wife, which is another courageous conversation. So I go to my father, but before I go to my father, I think to myself, so Dad's an alcoholic. If I can get to him when he's not drinking, this might be easier. It might not kill him. He might not beat me up. So I decided to get to him about 10 in the morning,
Oh.
called my father and said, Dad, I want to come over and talk to you about the circumstance between Wendy and I. And I got to his place. I think he maybe had one drink. So he was civil, which was really great. And my father loved me dearly. He loved me dearly. And I walked in, I positioned myself, I sat on the sofa, I made sure the door was unlocked in case he was going to beat me up. I could get out really, really quick. So
Wow.
at that time, Mia, my coming out story took about 2 hours to tell. And of course, now I can tell it in 5 seconds by sharing with you that I have a husband. That's kind of my coming out story now. So I launch into this and finally get to the point and say to Dad, the reason why Wendy and I are no longer together is because I'm gay.
Mm.
So the bomb drops. My father looks at me. He puts his arms on the side of the chair and pushes himself up. And I think to myself, ooh, I better run. He stood up. He looked at me. He walked past me, walked into the kitchen, poured himself a drink. He turned around, stood in the kitchen for a second, came back to the chair, sat down. I'm terrified. Nobody's saying anything. He sits down and he looks at me. He said, you're my son, and I love you.
Oh, bless him. That's such a beautiful story. So all that fear, which stops so many of us from having difficult conversations. I think that we're fearing the loss of love. And here he came back with, I love you and you're my son. Isn't that a
Yeah.
beautiful story?
Yes,
And
and
I,
of course,
but I, yeah,
and I made up the story, right? I kind of leaned into, right, what my aunt told me, his sister, and what
yeah.
my brother told me. And before I went, this is the thought I had. This is a really difficult conversation with me with my dad. But I thought this, I know this man really well, and I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust. And the other thing, Mia, that he did was he told me that, you're my son and I love you. He started to cry. I have
Mm.
never in my entire life, that was the only time I saw my father cry.
Oh, what was that like for you?
It was just extraordinary because part of the coming out process was being able to lean into, right, all of those emotions and be that, because of course before, as a closeted gay man in a married relationship, anything that I
Yeah.
displayed that I thought was a little bit more feminine, like men crying, people would automatically assume they would know I was gay. And of course, that was my biggest terror, right? So to watch my father, who was a professional athlete, who served in the military, this tough 6'2", beautiful, beautiful man, cry in front of his newly out son was a really great message for me from him to lean
Mm-hmm.
into knowing, that it's okay. It's okay to actually have all of this. So it was just,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's just exquisite. So it's one of the gifts my father gave me. It was one of the gifts he gave me.
Yeah. And those are difficult conversations. I can hear
That
that,
was
but it really was a
really
gift.
difficult. It really was a gift. Yeah.
It is interesting how, because of our experiences, for most people, my clients, my friends, my family, all of them, anyone I know, we do tell ourselves stories consciously or unconsciously about the potential loss, the potential criticism and judgment if we need to go and express ourselves. And so I know what Thomas and I teach people help people with, support people, whatever you want to call it, what it is we do. It's we teach people to be, we help people and support them to learn to be empowered, that they have a right to their feelings and what they need, and that the balance of a relationship is dependent on that, on both people getting their needs met. I think that was something Dr. Phil said way back, at the beginning. A relationship is only as good as the two people getting their needs met, not one person.
Yes.
So as we're discussing, like you shared, that it's a process to learn how to communicate, to learn how to be brave, to learn how to be empowered. And it's something that we all really have to process and internalize for ourselves in terms of what that looks like. So with what I call the 5 C's, I love my 5 C's, they're qualities, and that if we can learn to use them and embrace them and make them part of who we are, those are going to automatically make us really good communicators, because we'll just learn what it is we need to do. And so the titles are simple, but they embrace a lot of stuff kind of underneath. So they're kind of, each title's its own umbrella of things of what they mean. So we're actually going to, I'm imagining we're going to try to help people understand this, I think, aren't we?
Indeed, because of course I think, tough talks are no walk in the park, right? They can leave us feeling anxious, stressed, desperate, and I think your 5 C's is a really great opportunity, at least to have a template to be able to walk into, or at least begin to think about walking into a difficult conversation with some structure for yourself. And
Yes.
and you and I, we love structure, right?
Oh, I love structure. It really creates a lot of safety for myself. And so next week when we discuss the structure of what a difficult conversation really looks like, these are the 5 things that you really need to embrace as part of who you are, I think, to be able to be a really good communicator, to be an effective communicator, to have a successful conversation. So I'll tell you what they are, and then we can talk about them. So consciousness. Well, that's just another word for awareness, personal growth, self-awareness. I use the word consciousness just because it's sort of, it embraces a lot. It's about becoming conscious of the stories you're telling yourself, conscious of the way your mind works in terms of the story. Oh, if I talk about this, they're not going to love me, or it might hurt my relationship, or they're going to hit me, or they're going to, whatever the story is. We all live with a certain amount of fear in there. Second one is compassion. And that's really a big word, compassion and empathy, because compassion you have to have for yourself as well as the other. And
Yes.
Compassion is recognizing, like Brené Brown says, which I love, is that everyone's doing the best that they can. And then embracing that as the basis for having that conversation, that everyone's doing the best they can. The other one I love, because when I was a little girl, I was told not to do this, which is curiosity. And that embraces a huge amount of stuff. I'm talking about healthy curiosity in terms of really wanting to understand another person, asking really good questions, for leaving a container for that person to talk about what they need and want, including yourself. You want that to be a reciprocal thing. So curiosity, I think, is a really big one. Well, they're all big, actually, when you think about it. Courage. So Thomas has just shared such a brilliant story of what amount of courage it takes. Now, I know for myself, and I'm not going to cry, but I know that if I have to go into a difficult conversation, or I might cry, I get really anxious. I get really afraid. My heart pounds, because there's an element of risk for me in terms of judgment, criticism, which I've experienced so much in my life. Or what you need and want isn't important. You're wrong. A lot of all that kind of stuff goes on in my head. But I try to be brave, and I still have the conversation, even though my heart's pounding. So courage, I think, is a really big one. And the root word of courage is coeur, which in French means heart. So it's like the Tin Man. Yes, the coeur. It's like needing your heart, like the Tin Man needing your heart. And the fifth one really encompasses a lot for me. It's commitment. And commitment is something that we probably just think, oh yeah, I'm committed. No. How you act, how you behave, how the other person shows up, that shows what you're committed to. And so commitment, I think, is a really important one to throw in there. And there's probably a million other C's that are really important in developing good relationships, like chocolate. But, I could probably think of a million. But we're going to just discuss the 5 today and what they mean. So,
chocolate is a food group. Chocolate is a food group. Something like that. Let's go 6 C's. Chocolate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, with a little heart beside it. So,
absolutely.
Tell me, I want to know, when you're working with people, your own personal experience of what does it take for all of us to become conscious? Because at the end of the day, there is sort of this spiritual hierarchy, which I think is very ego-driven, or a consciousness hierarchy and I call it woo-woo. However, really for me, it's about knowing myself at a really deep, intimate level. So I can present that to others, because love really is the gift of yourself. So consciousness. Can you share some thoughts on that?
I can. One of the greatest gifts, and I think the challenge, I remember difficult conversations where I came into thinking that my work was to take care of the other person.
Yeah.
Which was really arrogant. It was really manipulative. It was loaded with a bunch of other things. My point in this notion of being conscious is to ensure that I'm aware, ensure that you're aware that having these conversations really helps us cultivate our own integrity, right? It helps us to develop the courage and the honesty we need to address the hard moments, not just in that particular moment in a hard conversation, but the hard moments that are going to come to us in our future. So that consciousness this is work that we commit to for ourselves. The conversation I had with my father was for me, right? He would get to do whatever it is that he needed to do it, because the fact of the matter is that our lives they're going to continue to be peppered with difficult conversations. So that consciousness, Mia, which I think is really brilliant and a great seed to start with. And let me just remind myself and folks that are listening and watching, make it about you.
Yeah, it's always about, yeah. And I loved what you said, because I think in the middle of the night I was dreaming about this, was that consciousness, I think, and as I said, it's the umbrella for integrity.
Indeed.
Honesty, authenticity, and responsibility. So, and responsibility is a huge value of mine, is I'm going to take care of me, and I'm going to share with myself, and you're going to take care of you, and you're going to express yourself in an authentic, honest, integral way. That's sort of my expectation. Now, not everybody can do that yet.
Correct.
Or is aware, but that's why some of the other things we can learn to do will help build on that. When we're where we're at, and another person is where they're at, and we might experience them as difficult in some way, we can sort of lead by example, if you know what I mean. We can change the dynamic by knowing and expressing ourselves authentically. Does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, because of course we're learning, right? We're learning how to be brave.
Yes.
Because of course this is not the only hard conversation we're going to have. We begin to equip ourselves for the next conflict that we face, or the next situation that calls for us to address the discomfort that exists in us, right? The issue that comes up, the emotion that comes up for us. The idea of consciousness is, what's going on for me? And for the longest time, it was really challenging for me, because I didn't want to be 100% responsible for my life. I was the victim. I chose that really easily. I was taught that by my parents, particularly mom. So this is a great reminder for me, right? This consciousness is about how important is it for me to continue to have these hard, these difficult, these delicate conversations, because of course, given where we come from, we might not be all that comfortable being 100% responsible for what goes on for us. we might want to talk to other people and take care of what their needs are, which is impossible, right? Absolutely impossible. So I think you make
Yeah,
great sense, Mia, in terms of a little bit of a deeper dive underneath consciousness.
absolutely. And I mean, I, yeah, that was perfect. It was a good summary of exactly what I was trying to express. And I do want to just repeat, we're not talking about having those conversations with people that are pathological or textbook in terms of narcissism, abuse, stuff like that. Those, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the people in your relationship with on a daily basis. We, we all end up with, as we say, conflict, but I also want to be really clear about what a conflict is.
Yes.
Conflict is when you've got something you really need and the other person has something they really need, and you're both fighting to get what you need. What we're talking about in terms of consciousness is below that, in terms of understanding what your values are that have been compromised in some way, what your needs are, what your principles are that you stand on every day, that you can bring to the table, which actually shouldn't create conflict per se in terms of arguing, because no one can argue with your needs and your values, your
As,
principles and your
as,
feelings.
as long as you are clear about what they are for you,
Exactly. And
right?
I think that then there's the part there where it's presenting all of that without judgment of the other, without saying you're doing it wrong, I'm doing it right, or, and somehow manipulating or having a hidden agenda about how you're going to get what you need. So that's where the responsibility part comes in, and I loved what you said. It really described it very, very well. So thank you for that. That was
You're
that was
welcome.
that was good. So let's move on to compassion.
Okay.
Um, that's a mixed bag C for me,
I can feel
because
that. I can feel
yeah,
that.
well, kind of
Yeah.
like what you said about I can have so much compassion for others that I forget to look after myself. Now, that is a negative pattern from my childhood, and I'm not doing that anymore. So, compassion. Thank you, Thomas.
You're welcome.
Yay for the win! Sometimes I get out of compassion if I recognize I'm giving too much of it away and not looking after myself. And there's that whole dynamic going on. But a lot of people don't know what compassion is in terms of how it can help you be a really good communicator.
Hmm.
It's having understanding, appreciation, respect that the other person is just going through their own stuff. It's having compassion that we're all doing the best that we can, that we're all trying, and coming from that premise. I, I think.
Lovely. As well, I think that because, of course, we all.
Oh, that was a big sigh.
It was a big thing. Well,
Oh.
I remembered learning, right? I remember learning this notion of kind of not being who I wanted to be in my life. So the
Mhm,
closeted, quote unquote, straight guy. And taking a breath, realizing at that time, although I couldn't recognize, and I remember some therapy work, and the question was, Thomas, do you think there were other people around you that were also gay? And of course I said no. And the therapist said, might there have been other people around you that were gay and
mhm,
you just weren't able to recognize them at that time? So this
mhm,
idea of compassion, first of all, having it for ourselves and being able to really embrace that, trusting that a difficult conversation might be equally as challenging for the person that we want to have it with. Because
mhm,
oftentimes it might be the only way that we can energetically bond with them as they go through their prep for it. They might be having the same emotions. They may be afraid, they might be frustrated, they might not know how to be brave, all things that, and my point in this me is that when I come from that place, I realize I am connected already on some level with that person, even before I begin that difficult conversation. So this self-compassion
absolutely.
for me, yeah, takes a breath and realize, oh, I'm not alone here. My ego wants me to think I'm alone,
Yes,
right?
but
This
you're not.
this this fear of rejection, right? The core need to be loved and accepted by people around me.
Mhm.
That this person I'm coming into the difficult conversation with probably is coming from a similar place. So that just has me realize, wow, I'm not alone, right? As social creatures, it means that I can surround myself with people that can also meet my needs, but they've got to be able to articulate what they are for themselves to me, and of course, me to them.
Yeah, and I think compassion has a lot of vulnerability to it as well, because you're sort of settling into really you're getting out of your ego about
Yes,
you, so it's
yes,
all about you, but it's also not all about you, if you know what I mean.
I do.
So yeah, exactly. And so I think compassion is a really important quality to embrace in terms of accepting and trusting about the other person, that it's okay for us to wobble and be all over the place and wow, okay, so what are they experiencing, what are they going through, and also for yourself when you're trying to process all of that. And that's why one of the things I like to really lead with, and I'll teach that to everybody next week, is intention. And I've often said you have to lead with an intention, and if you're really clear with your intention and you open a conversation with that, and it's held in compassion, then the intention can take on the conversation and can really lead off from what your intention is. Are you wanting to create more connection with this person? Are you wanting to create more appreciation or understanding? When you lead a conversation from that place of compassion, it really can just set up the conversation in a way, healthier way. Compassion is the antidote to pain and hurt and arguing, honestly. So when you see somebody who's arguing and, being difficult and having their moment, having compassion in that and just being quiet is actually the best thing you can do. It is the antidote for all of that other hard stuff. I think that's true.
It is very true. It is the guiding light for me in my life, and many folks that might know me and are listening to this, they know all the examples in my life that intention has brought. And I'm right there with you. Yes, absolutely.
Well, and you have a lot of compassion for others, and I don't think that we would do the job that we do if we didn't.
Very true.
And again, of course, it's the balance in there as well, because sometimes I run out of compassion when I'm not being clear. So curiosity. When I say the word curiosity in terms of communication with people, what comes up for you?
Well, that old expression immediately, and this is not a proper answer.
I know.
Just says, curiosity kills the cat.
Kill the cat.
And of course, I was taught that, which really was an invitation for my family. Don't wonder about anything that the family's not wondering about, right? Don't be curious. Don't ask questions. And I remember reading a study much earlier in my life that suggested for those children that were provided answers by their parents when they asked why, those children would have a much, much higher level of academic smarts, worldly smarts. And that wasn't a gift that I received in my childhood. So I had to go other places with my curiosity. And I don't know how it is that I was inspired to do that, but I was. So the key, the key, curiosity. And I would bring to me people, right? This one beautiful man who has since taken his last breath was the most curious person I ever met. And there were times where his curiosity would piss me off, but I got to learn that what he was showing me was how it is that I didn't value it, how it is I didn't really lean into being curious in my life. And today, in his honor all the time, when a part of me just wants to kind of lay back and go, I'm actually not going to go down that path. And I think of Kenneth, and what comes up for me is, wow, he would walk down there and he would discover some amazing things. He would meet amazing people. So I think this C, Mia, is really, really powerfully important. The curiosity that we invoke for ourselves, what might be available for us if we actually can be successful in having this difficult conversation.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in my life being criticized for being curious, which is interesting.
Oh.
And criticism is on the no C list, by the way. Yeah, the no C of communication. Yeah, a lot of the times I automatically do it, and I always have. I used to get in so much trouble, for being curious as a kid. My mother would look at me like, are you insane? But I was just naturally curious about what people thought and how they felt and what was important to them and all of that. Like, for me, that connection with somebody else, how could I not know somebody if I'm not deepening the conversation and actually being curious about their experience and who they are? So, like, I asked what was it yesterday? Oh, I asked somebody what they were doing for their anniversary as a celebration. They went, "That's private." I'm not. We have something we do. It's traditional. I'm going, ooh. Sometimes curiosity kind of bites me in the butt, and people think that I'm being nosy or asking personal questions. But it's more like I should maybe ask it differently. So what's important that you're going to celebrate for your anniversary or something like that? I don't know.
Or the other thing, Mia, because it really is a beautiful quality that you possess, and sometimes it's difficult to take about and realize that what's coming up for that person in relation to their ability to kind of be in this energy of you being curious has nothing to do with you. It's their stuff.
Exactly. And I think that that's really an important thing to remember because I don't know about the rest of you, but I could automatically go to, oops, I did that wrong. I need to
Yeah.
monitor myself. No,
No.
I walked away and I went, I'm going to feel empowered. I was curious because I love this person. So,
Yes.
and I'd love to know what celebrations are important to them, what their heart makes their heart sing. So I'm not going to apologize for my curiosity anymore.
Well, and that you would come from love
I
in wanting to
always
have a
come from
better
love.
understanding of what's going on for them in the relationship. And when I think of Kenneth and the gift that he gave me by showing me curiosity and then being able to walk that extra little bit to discover what was at the end of the walk or around the corner was I realized I lacked a lot of confidence, right? It permeated kind of every
Mm,
aspect of my life. And it led me to believe that I don't have a right to actually be curious in the world. And of course, that was not true. It just wasn't shown to
yeah.
me by my family. And he was so great at helping me understand that I had this inner critic that was on a rampage most of the time that basically said, status quo, Thomas, just be happy with what you've got. Don't
Yeah.
go exploring. Don't ask questions, all for those reasons. And of course, I realize now much of the reason why I didn't want to do that was I was afraid that I would be busted by folks when having them understand that I had no level of curiosity at all, which was really sad for me at that
Mm.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, that is sad.
Yes, it is.
It's nice that you've learned to do that differently.
I
Now
have.
yes, I do have to want to say one. I do want to say one thing about curiosity is that there are certain ways to express, and we're going to discuss this next week in way more depth, which I wish you were going to be there for, but I'm not going to say that again. I don't. So, is that there's certain questions that you really want to ask people from an open-ended place. You want to ask questions that are, what was that like for you? How do you feel
Mm.
about that? Very short little sentences, and they don't start with why. There's something about the word WHY that implies a judgment. And if you're telling me something, and I go, well, why, Thomas? Then there's there's sort of a criticism behind the word why. I don't know why, but most of us experience it like that. Well, why would you do that? Or why was that? It has a kind of a negative connotation. So one of the things that we learned a lot at school was not to use the word why. I mean, of course, there's obvious times when you use the word why, but not in a communication sense. It's really important to be curious and use the words how, what,
Yes.
what was that like? How did you feel about that? As I said, so from that place. So why is like a non-word when it comes to curiosity. When you're trying to discuss something that's sensitive to both people, it's you're trying to create a connection and an understanding. Why is not a word you want to use. I just wanted to throw that in there because I know that why can be a difficult thing to hear.
And how and finding the courage to ask that question. And when I do, what I get to
Mm-hmm.
learn is the mechanics behind how it is that that person created that circumstance for themselves.
Mm.
There's a bigger why connected to our purpose, and that's our individual work. But in relation to really wanting to discover, so initially when I got pissed off because Kenneth was so curious, I would ask why, and of course I would get from him why it was important for him. But then when I began to ask how, he then became a teacher of curiosity for
Mm.
me.
Oh, you see, there's a big difference there.
Huge difference, because then
Yeah.
I opened myself up to learning and maybe being able to lean into the quality of how he did it and the
Mm-hmm.
mechanic of how he did it, and therefore it could become a value for me, which it did, of course, which it did.
Yeah. It's kind of like I could say, well, why did you do that? Um, or I could say, what was important about doing that?
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. Or how did it make you feel when you did that? So those are completely different questions
They
from
are.
why did you do that?
Yes.
Like, anyway. So, and then that, you already expressed that it takes courage
It does.
to be curious.
Yes.
It takes,
And remember, the partner with courage is vulnerability, right?
yes, you
Yes.
can't be courageous without vulnerability. And
Sure.
of course, I hope everybody's watched Brené Brown's, her TED talk on vulnerability and the importance and the value of of how it impacts yourself as well as others when you're when you're vulnerable. It's different. And yet again, you have to know who you can be vulnerable with and who you can't be vulnerable with. Because
Correct.
you really wouldn't want to be vulnerable or go through this process or have those qualities or express it like I'm going to teach you next week in with somebody who's abusive or not able to hear what you're saying. Let's put it that way.
Indeed. The fourth
Yeah.
C,
Yes. So courage.
courage.
And as I said before, we all have to define for ourselves, this is the consciousness piece, what it is that we're afraid of, what it is that makes it difficult to have that conversation, and being able to acknowledge that and feel that, and then go, okay, wait a minute, I'm going to be brave. I'm going to be courageous because I know this is important. Because it serves you. It serves you. It serves me. It serves both people in the relationship. So having courage, and I think it takes a huge amount of courage to be in a relationship with people. It really does.
It
So for me,
does.
it's one of the biggest C's, I think.
Yes. Yeah. And embedded in that for me is this notion of, and my father helped me learn this, prepare yourself helps you be more courageous, right?
Yes. Yes.
Being able to kind of dump the assumptions going into the conversation helps you be more courageous. Leave the assumptions at the door and go in with an open heart and open mind. And this
And
idea of
trust.
also, yeah, and trust that you can be on the same level with this person. That invokes courage in our lives.
Yes,
Being
it does.
respectful invokes courage, right?
Yes, it does.
Maintaining respect for one another, no matter how sensitive things might get. The idea of
Mm-hmm.
being respectful is really important. Being clear about what comes up for you comes for me from a place of courage, that I'll take the time to consider the clarity I want to bring for myself, right? And bring some really specific examples around that for myself. And then it takes courage not to walk away from a from a in another word that I use for these conversations, it was a courageous conversation. Courage, this idea of keeping the courage to keep yourself and make a commitment not to walk away from the conversation, right? Never call a conversation quits without the consent of that other person that's with you. So you are so right, Mia. Courage is a big foundational piece to these really challenging conversations for
Well,
us.
it is. And you said it. The next thing is that courage is part of commitment.
Ah, yes.
I think it's Harville Hendricks, Amagos, writes this little statement out, which is just a brilliant one. Maybe I'll share it next week if I can find it. Just saying that I'm going to commit to staying in the conversation, and he says that that's one of the most important parts of marriage, or being a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, I think it's really important in all areas of your life. You're committed to staying with the conversation, whatever it is that the goal is at the end,
The intention.
which is the intention. Of course, intention again is the goal, the hope, the dream, all of that, whatever it is that's the goal up here, the commitment to reaching that point for both parties in the conversation, I think is really important. What do you think about that?
If it isn't for you, then there's a bigger question about what the hell you're doing in that. If there isn't a self-commitment for you. So first of all, I've got to be committed to me, that there's
Mm-hmm.
something within me that I value and I treasure for wanting to participate, having a difficult conversation, that relationship. If commitment isn't there for me, if I can't source what that is for me, that might invoke a completely different route to what's really going on for me even before I go into that difficult conversation. So commitment for me in my life is so important. And another tough one to learn for me, this notion of being 100% committed. What is the old joke? Commitment and being involved is likened to a bacon and eggs breakfast, right? The pig's committed, the chicken's involved.
I've never heard that before. That's a new one on me.
And I was the chicken in so much of my life where I really wasn't committed. And when I learned what commitment was about for me, and when I source how important a relationship is for me and how committed I am to it, it's a big inspiration for the how that I'm going to bring into the conversation. So it's an anchor, right? Commitment, I would move it around, but oftentimes I think what's important for me is to realize, wow, how much of a commitment do I have to this? How much do I want to add to it? And of course, I get to do that by having these uncomfortable conversations. So yeah, commitment is so important, Mia, so important.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It's about showing up. It's being committed to showing up. It's, all the things that we could define commitment as. It's really something that we need to embrace and acknowledge at what level we're committed, like you said,
yes.
In the relationship. Because also, if you're not committed to yourself, especially first, then there's an issue there in the relationship, and then there's an imbalance. So commitment is pretty important. And I guess it depends on what you want. True. I'm committed to my relationships because I want deep, meaningful conversations of a mutual curiosity and compassion and levels of awareness and learning from each other. So for me, I'm committed to that.
Yes.
And it's wonderful when, even if we're at different levels of abilities or consciousness or awareness, that at least those people that I know, that I love, are committed at wherever they're at to do that. And I think that that's such a big gift. I think I'm totally blessed.
I agree with you. And isn't it interesting? That's a self-invoked blessing for you, as it is for me. And I go into, for the few, which is a treasure for me, for the few relationships that I have that are really deep, and they're important for me to be deep. I sussed out quite a while ago whether or not that was a commitment that somebody wanted to make, right? For a relationship I had with a dearest friend who we probably been connected, started in 1995. It was this notion of knowing that she was really committed to, in a very different way than me, she was really committed to having a better understanding of what was going on. And at that time, as I was learning to be committed to me, I needed an outer reflection of somebody that was also committed to themselves, so that when we got together, and we joke now, because we realize there's so many different circumstances, whether we were meeting at Science World with a green slimy drink from Starbucks, it was this idea of we came together to reflect back to each other the commitment we had around what was most important for us, how we were challenged when we didn't think it was important, or how it was we needed to discover from each other how maybe this might not be the most important relationship for us to be in. So it was this great share, but it came from the two of us really being mirrors of commitment, and that value being really strong. And of course, it created some extraordinary conversations, many of them that have everything to do with who it is that I'm being with you in relation to the experience of who it is that I am today. So commitment, boy, capital C, commitment.
It's a big one. And I think the pandemic has actually, I don't want to, just go by that either. I think the pandemic has actually amplified the need for commitment when it comes to relationships, friendships, whether it's family or friends. Being committed to staying connected. So,
Yes.
I mean, connection is at the top of all of this in terms of a conversation. So that's why I came up with the C's, because it's connection, conversation, and then it's all the C's. Same thing during the pandemic. It's taken a lot of commitments to try to stay connected, to do my best to stay connected with the people that I care about, that I love, even people that are acquaintances rather than best friends, or any of that. So I know it's been harder for people because we've lost so much of that connection, and it takes time. Commitment takes time. It takes energy. Commitment calls you to have to learn to be conscious. Commitment calls you to have to learn to be compassionate and curious. So and having courage. So I think commitment, as I said, is kind of at the bottom here, but it's kind of one of the, they're all really important, but it encompasses a lot. It's not just the word commitment.
It's true. It feels like if I plugged the 4 C's into a basket and the container was called something, I would call that container commitment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a great one. I like that. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Oh, I learned so much from you, Thomas.
Thank you. And this idea of having difficult conversations is really a part. I didn't want it to be at one point in time. It's really a part of adulting. It's a part of an adult life. And we can, yeah, it is true. We can master them when we spend some time getting to know ourselves in the ways in which we handle conflict and discourse, right? It's exactly. This, getting down to things with someone important is never easy, right? But it can be done when we get out of our own way and remember the mutual respect and understanding that we all crave. When I remember that person is coming in with perhaps a similar value for me, it has me remember that. Yeah, this is a gorgeous practice session. Yeah, I'm uncomfortable. I'm not confident. I think that they might not love me or not like me. And then of course I notice the story I'm making and I take a breath and I realize that I really want to become a master of tough talks so that I can actually know that I'm going to continue, right, to breathe into and receive the values that are important for me in my life.
Exactly. I just love what you just said. That's just so true. It is interesting. I've noticed that as you're talking, I'm remembering conversations I've had, and my youngest son, who actually, he's 27, just turned 27, and I still think of him as the baby in the family, and so do his brothers, but he loves that word. He goes, oh, it has been so exhausting adulting today. And I said, why? And that starts the whole conversation about having to be responsible for his feelings, not wanting to project on other people. He's very deep. He's an excellent communicator because he's learned to take responsibility. He understands that he's not going to project all that stuff on other people. He's still moving out of the people-pleasing phase to really understand his own needs. And I've got 3 sons who are like the most amazing communicators with their partners, with people. Doesn't always look like we're just discussing differences. Sometimes it looks like conflict, but it's commitment again. We always come down to it. And I just want to really be clear that conflict usually is the second stage. The first stage is that you're discussing differences, differences of opinion, a difference of ideas, what you want to do for the day, and that's all about your values and your needs. So that's the good thing about learning about being a good communicator and all of these things, is that you can kind of get past having to go into a big conflict with, if you can start at the beginning. It makes a huge difference, I think in all of your relationships, even if it's over something simple.
And those two elements that you described, right, in the baby in your family, your 27-year-old son, is that he's self-aware and that he's willing to practice this notion of adulting. And sure, I really get tired from time to time of adulting, but I realize that there, by the grace of God, there go I, and this notion of I continue to commit to. I need to practice it, right? I want to prepare myself to know that a difficulty is coming. And I really am appreciating the comment you made about if you can be much more aware in the beginning and kind of catch something when it comes up, as opposed to becoming either the big mess or addressing the issue honestly and openly before it actually moving to a place where it becomes difficult for both of you, is I think a great skill. And it is that compassion for ourselves that allows us to be able to recognize when somebody in front of us has a need. We can be listening for it, reflect back to them what it is that they need, and then make a decision whether or not we're going to do that. So
that's one of my big lines. I love it.
Self-awareness, yes.
Yeah, is what do you need right now? And I think asking somebody, what do you need? What's the need that's not being met here? What's going on? Because I think that's where most of our conflicts come from. And it's so integral to who we are that we're not even, if we don't recognize that there's a need, whatever it is. I might have a need to go get coffee, but it's a need. you know, and I'm just saying, and then the other person isn't ready. They're, oh no, we're not doing that, or whatever. Understanding, even in the minutia of daily life, we're always expressing our needs and who we are and what we want and what we value. And so that's, I guess, the first part, which is consciousness and becoming aware of that. And then that can make us be better communicators and avoid conflict.
And the value of, and I remember listening to a podcast with Brene Brown and Austin Channing, who is one of the linchpins in the Black Lives Matter movement. And she said this to Brene, you know, when I get a sense that you can't see me, especially as a Black person, she said, I realize that you can't hear me. So we want to be seen. And when we're not seen, I realize that when somebody can't see me for all of the color that I am, and I don't mean that racially, it would be the gay part of me, it would be the intellect, it would be the compassion. When I'm not seen, I suddenly realize, wow, they're probably not hearing me either.
Yes, and then that gives you the opportunity to express yourself differently if they're not hearing you.
Very true. My responsibility
and I
to
know
express
exactly.
myself differently. Yeah.
And I know when I've had conflict coming at me, and I'm not expecting it, it's because I probably haven't expressed myself in a way that they could hear it. And as you say, see you. I think that's just brilliant. Now I'm just getting really aware that we're coming to the end of our hour. As
Indeed.
always, it always goes by so fast. I hate that. That's
and yet it's a great sign for me. I'm there with you. It's like, oh, do we have to end? But my point is this to kind of close, and of course you'll do the closing for us, but only when you realize that you and you alone are responsible for your emotions and your reactions will you be able to come to the table with a mutual eye to understanding that you need to find a resolution that actually works, not just for yourself, but for the other person as well. It's this we being greater than I.
Yes, exactly. And that there's the team in that. I think also that's what I'm going to discuss next week, is that as you're learning this, as you know, nonviolent communication started from Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, I think it's important in a way to have a structure. And so I'm going to really delve into the structure. So we've talked about the qualities you need. I'm going to dive into using those qualities in a conversation structure. Once you've done that 21 times, you've practiced it, as Thomas says. When you've done it, you know, everything starts to shift in your brain and in your heart because you're practicing it, you're doing it, you're changing how your brain is wired to be able to have those conversations in a more automatic way. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week. And as you can tell, it's why I do what I do, because it's the most important piece to me, is that how can anybody know you if you can't communicate to them and connect? So that's what we're going to learn next week. I'm going to give you the structure, and we're going to talk about what that looks like and how you do it. And part of it has to do with planning, as you said in part of what we were saying, is actually practicing it and being really clear so that you know exactly what it is that what needs to be said. And going from there. So I think I'm looking forward to next week. I really am going to miss you, but I do wish you the best of luck when it comes to, you know, moving back home. You've got yourself in two places and getting settled in and all that kind of stuff. So we will miss you. I know I speak for everybody. I'm sure that we will miss you. But my best to both of you, and I hope that goes really, really well.
Thank you.
And then the following week, Thomas will be back, but he'll be sitting, maybe we'll even see some palm trees, in Hawaii. Let's have a backdrop of Hawaii. Anyway, everybody, we're going to love you because we're going to go off, and we'll talk to you next week, and love you all.
Lots of love.
Bye.